The moment the US ordered the EU to cancel a $105 billion loan, the room at the European Central Bank went silent. Not because they didn't expect pressure, but because they finally realized they had run out of room to pretend they were in control. This wasn't diplomacy. This was a command. And commands, when they hit institutions built on the illusion of stability, create shockwaves that don't stay contained. And today, I'm going to tell you exactly why this single order may trigger the largest financial identity crisis Europe has faced in 2 decades. And why the panic inside the ECB is far less about the money and far more about what this moment exposes. The sudden US directive demanding that the EU cancel a $105 billion loan did not strike Europe as a financial disagreement. It struck like an exposure of everything they feared was true. Inside the ECB, the panic wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the kind of panic that happens when people realize they are no longer operating with choices, only consequences. That directive hit a fault line that Europe had been pretending wasn't there. For months, the ECB had been projecting confidence, speaking about unity and strategic collaboration, but beneath all of that was a quiet, unspoken truth. Europe had tied itself so tightly to US policy decisions that a single American instruction could override months of European economic planning. This loan was more than money. It was a symbolic line showing that Europe still had agency, still had sovereign control over its own financial commitments. When Washington told them to cancel it, it shattered that illusion. The panic spread because the order arrived at the worst possible moment. Europe was already under tremendous pressure after the Russian asset seizure, navigating backlash, investor uncertainty, and geopolitical friction. Adding a US command on top of that created an emotional and strategic overload. ECB officials understood that if they complied, they would reinforce the belief that Europe is not acting out of economic strategy, but out of obedience. If they resisted, they risked fracturing the transatlantic partnership that underpins their security architecture. That double bind created the quiet suffocation inside the institution, the sense of being cornered by forces larger than the policies they had crafted. Economists within the ECB also understood the long-term implications. If investors see Europe bending to US directives under pressure, it erodes credibility. It signals instability, not resilience. Global markets rely on confidence, predictability, and autonomy. Losing any of those is dangerous. Losing all three simultaneously is catastrophic. So the panic wasn't just about a canceled loan. It was about the spotlight that the US directive suddenly cast on Europe's dependency, its vulnerability, and the fragility of its economic narrative. The shock came not from what the US asked, but from what the request revealed, that the balance of power was far more lopsided than Europe had been willing to admit. The Russian asset seizure was presented as a bold, decisive move, a show of unified Western strength. But behind the public messaging, the reality was far more fragile, and everyone inside major financial institutions knew it. Seizing another nation's sovereign reserves is not just a political gesture, it is an earthquake that shakes the foundation of global financial trust. The moment Europe froze those Russian assets, it crossed a line that had been respected for decades. The understanding that no matter how tense geopolitics became, national reserves held abroad were untouchable. Breaking that norm opened the door to consequences nobody could fully control. This is why the seizure instantly became the trigger for deeper fears within global markets. If Russia's reserves could be taken, then any country outside the Western sphere had to wonder whether their assets were safe. That doubt spreads like smoke, quietly, invisibly, but fast. Capital begins to shift, not all at once, but gradually, hedging against a future where Western institutions might weaponize financial systems more aggressively. The fear is not about Russia alone. It's about the precedent. And precedents, once set, develop lives of their own. Inside the ECB, this fear was amplified because they understood exactly how interconnected financial ecosystems are. The Russian asset seizure was not happening in isolation. It collided with an already unstable global environment. Fractured supply chains, rising interest rates, and geopolitical rivalries intensifying by the month. In that atmosphere, Seizing Russian assets signaled desperation rather than confidence. It suggested that Western leverage was thinning and punitive financial tools were becoming substitutes for genuine diplomatic influence. That perception is dangerous because it encourages adversaries to seek alternate financial alliances, accelerating the rise of parallel economic systems beyond Western control. Russia, of course, reacted sharply, not only with political outrage, but with strategies aimed at undermining Western monetary dominance. Europe understood that retaliation would come not just through policies, but through energy, trade, realignment, and deeper coordination with nations that resent Western dominance. This created an environment where the asset seizure acted like a spark in a room filled with dry fuel. The action itself was small compared to the emotional and strategic chain reaction it unleashed. It forced Europe to confront the uncomfortable truth that financial warfare rarely ends cleanly. It reverberates, destabilizes, and exposes vulnerabilities that institutions cannot easily repair. European banks were already operating in a delicate environment, balancing inflation, energy instability, and geopolitical tension. But when the US stepped in and demanded that the EU cancel a $105 billion loan, while Europe was still dealing with the fallout from the Russian asset seizure, it struck at the heart of something far more fragile than policy: investor trust. Banks don't fear volatility as much as they fear unpredictability driven by political pressure. The moment financial decisions appear externally controlled rather than internally reasoned, confidence begins to fracture. Investors want to believe that Europe operates on stable, rules-based principles. But the asset seizure made it clear that the rules could be rewritten emotionally, and the US demand made it clear that Europe wasn't the one writing them. Inside major financial institutions, executives understand that trust is not just a market sentiment. It is the backbone of global capital flow. After the asset seizure, private conversations already included questions like, if Western governments can freeze assets based on political conflicts, then what else can they do? When investors start asking those questions, they begin adjusting portfolios quietly, shifting wealth into safer jurisdictions or more politically neutral environments. European banks immediately sensed this undercurrent. They knew that complying with another US directive would amplify those fears, suggesting that Europe does possess autonomous control over its economic commitments. The risk wasn't just about losing Russian trust. It was about losing the trust of dozens of countries whose reserves or investments move through European institutions every single day. If these nations start perceiving Europe as an extension of US strategic will, rather than an independent financial power, they will hesitate to keep money parked in European banks. This hesitation translates into liquidity concerns, credit tightening, and long-term reputational damage that cannot be undone with press releases or diplomatic statements. European bankers also understand how quickly market psychology can shift. A single directive from Washington carries the power to create a narrative that Europe is not leading but following, not deciding but complying. And once that narrative gains traction, investors don't wait for clarity, they move preemptively. That is why the panic inside European banks was so profound. The fear was not the loan itself, but the pattern it represented, a pattern that undermines the very stability Europe depends on to function as a global financial hub. The EU suddenly found itself standing in the center of a dilemma it had been trying to avoid for years. On one side was the United States, its most powerful military ally and the backbone of Europe's security architecture. On the other was the hard truth that obeying Washington's directive to cancel a $105 billion loan would expose Europe's lack of economic independence. This was not a simple financial decision. It was a geopolitical loyalty test wrapped inside an economic order. For European leaders, it felt like being forced to choose between two identities, the one they present to the world and the one they privately know is true. The US directive hit a deeper insecurity within the EU because Europe has spent decades proclaiming strategy. Sea autonomy while relying heavily on American defense intelligence and diplomatic muscle. That dependency becomes painfully visible during crises. So when Washington issued the command, European leaders understood what it implied. Refusing would create tension with the partner that effectively guarantees their security, especially against Russia. Compliance, however, would signal to the world that Europe's foreign policy is not self-determined, but externally guided. That type of exposure damages the EU's authority, not just politically, but economically, because markets react negatively when a region appears unable to make independent decisions. In the background, European diplomats were painfully aware that the Russian asset seizure had already stretched relations with many countries that were watching closely to see how the West treats financial sovereignty. Canceling the $105 billion loan under U.S. pressure would reinforce the narrative that decisions in Europe do not reflect European interests, but American priorities. That perception carries enormous consequences because geopolitical credibility directly affects investment flows, trade negotiations, and diplomatic leverage. At the same time, resisting the U.S. is not a neutral choice. European governments know that their defense capabilities are deeply intertwined with American support through NATO. Breaking from Washington risks creating fractures at a time when security tensions are high. And that fear of being exposed, defenseless, isolated, or punished economically, creates internal paralysis. Europe's leaders were not simply choosing between obeying a request or rejecting it. They were choosing which form of vulnerability they were willing to reveal to the world. Markets don't wait for governments to make official statements. They react to signals, pressure points, and sudden shifts in power. So when the US ordered the EU to cancel a $105 billion loan, at the same time Europe was still dealing with the fallout of the Russian asset seizure, the financial world responded instantly. Currency traders watched the euro wobble because sudden political interference usually hints at deeper instability. Bond markets grew nervous because Europe's ability to maintain predictable fiscal commitments was being called into question, and whispers spread through financial circles about potential liquidity tensions inside European banks. These reactions weren't dramatic explosions, but quiet tremors that reveal how sensitive global markets are to any hint that Europe is losing control of its economic narrative. The volatility wasn't driven by the loan itself, but by what the loan symbolized. A massive financial commitment being reversed under pressure suggests a lack of autonomy and a lack of long-term planning, both of which are red flags for investors. Market confidence depends on the belief that institutions operate on logic, stability, and clear economic principles. When a political power step overrides those principles, the markets read it as emotional decision-making, which is dangerous because emotional decisions create unpredictable financial consequences. Traders and investors have seen enough crises to know that external pressure often signals internal weakness. At the same time, bond markets began adjusting to the possibility that European governments might face tighter financial conditions. If the US could force Europe into abandoning large commitments, what else could it influence? Would future loans, stimulus plans, or bailout packages be vulnerable to Washington's geopolitical strategies? Those questions create doubt, and doubt is enough to push investors towards safer assets, away from European bonds and into alternatives like US Treasuries or emerging neutral markets. Subtle shift drains confidence from Europe's financial system. Whispers of a potential liquidity freeze also surfaced for a simple reason. Markets fear chain reactions. If nations or large institutions suspect instability, they start reducing exposure to European banks. As that happens, funding becomes more expensive, credit tightens, and smaller institutions feel pressure first. None of this needs to escalate into a crash for it to be harmful. The mere perception of instability can reshape financial behavior for months. The reaction to this crisis revealed just how fragile Europe's economic environment had become and how quickly fear spreads when political pressure replaces sound financial judgment. Russia saw the West's seizure of its assets not as an isolated act, but as a declaration that financial warfare was fully on the table. And when a major power feels cornered, it doesn't respond with a single counteraction. It responds by reshaping its alliances, its strategies, and its leverage points. The most immediate response was psychological rather than tactical. Moscow understood that Europe's move was driven by insecurity, not strength, which gave Russia the strategic advantage of choosing when and how to retaliate. It also confirmed what the Kremlin had suspected. For years, Western financial systems were willing to discard long-standing norms if the political climate demanded it. That realization encouraged Russia to pull closer to countries that share its distrust of Western institutions. Energy became the first and most obvious pressure point. Russia knows Europe's historical dependency on its pipelines, and while Europe has reduced that reliance, it has not eliminated it in practical terms. By signaling potential future constraints on energy supply or rerouting resources toward Asian partners, Russia reminded Europe that economic pressure can flow both ways. These moves were subtle but effective, creating anxiety in European markets that rely heavily on predictable energy flows for industrial stability. Simultaneously, Russia accelerated its alignment with non-Western financial blocs. Partnerships with China, India, the Middle East, and African nations took on new urgency. By increasing trade through alternative payment systems and shifting reserves away from Western banking networks, Russia worked to reduce the likelihood that future sanctions could meaningfully disrupt its economy. Every move in that direction also encouraged other nations to consider diversifying away from Western financial control, which is precisely what Europe feared after the asset seizure. Russia capitalized on that fear by presenting itself as a partner in a growing multipolar economic landscape. The crisis also pushed Russia to weaponize uncertainty itself. Even without dramatic actions, Russia's hints at retaliation created enough doubt to shake European markets. Strategic ambiguity, suggesting energy restrictions, legal challenges, or coordinated responses with other nations, forced Europe to remain on edge. Russia understood that unpredictability can be destabilizing, especially when Europe is already struggling with inflation, rising interest rates, and political fragmentation. The asset seizure, instead of weakening Russia, pushed it deeper into alternative global frameworks and gave it a stronger narrative to rally other countries that question Western financial dominance. Europe has spent years promoting the idea of strategic autonomy, insisting it can stand on its own, make independent decisions, and shape its own future. But this crisis exposed how fragile that claim truly is. When the U.S. ordered the EU to cancel the $105 billion loan, it became painfully clear that Europe's economic and geopolitical framework is still deeply intertwined with American influence. This wasn't just about money. It was a moment that revealed the imbalance in the partnership. The shock came from realizing that Europe's room to maneuver is far smaller than it publicly presents. The continent found itself in a position where it had to respond not as a self-determined power, but as an actor reacting to a larger force. This dependency was especially visible because it arrived right after Europe had taken a bold, controversial action, the seizure of Russian assets. That move was supposed to demonstrate strength and cohesion, yet it inadvertently revealed how dependent Europe remains on Western, specifically American, approval and support. When the U.S. stepped in with its directive, the illusion cracked. It showed that Europe doesn't have the sovereign economic freedom it claims, and that major decisions can be overridden by external pressure. This realization stung because European leaders have been trying to cultivate an image of independence, especially in foreign policy, security, energy, and finance. This crisis also exposed how emotionally reactive Europe becomes when its vulnerabilities are highlighted. European governments rushed to manage the optics, releasing statements and reassurances that clearly weren't convincing anyone who understood the deeper dynamics. Markets responded not to the announcements, but to the visible discomfort. The way European institutions hesitated, deflected, and avoided giving direct answers. That behavior communicated uncertainty, and uncertainty is something global actors can sense immediately. Another aspect of dependency appeared in Europe's internal divisions. Different member states reacted differently to the U.S. demand, revealing that the EU cannot form a unified stance under pressure. Some nations gravitated instantly toward Washington's line, while others resisted, not out of strategy, but out of identity and ideological concerns. This fragmentation itself is a weakness. because it shows external powers exactly how to apply leverage. The crisis didn't create Europe's dependency, it merely illuminated it. What deeply unsettled European leaders was realizing that the world now sees the cracks just as clearly as they do. At the core of this entire crisis is something far more human than economics, geopolitics, or diplomacy. It is the emotional landscape driving the decisions of governments that are terrified of losing control. When major powers act from confidence, their strategies are measured, predictable, and rooted in long-term planning. But when they act from fear, the decisions become reactive, erratic, and easily exposed. The Russian asset seizure, the U.S. directive to cancel the 105B loan, and Europe's panicked response all stem from governments trying to mask insecurity behind aggressive gestures. It is not strength that pushes nations into sudden disruptive actions. It is the dread of appearing weak in a world that is becoming more competitive and less tolerant of missteps. The West's decision to seize Russian assets did not come from a place of strategic calm, but from anxiety about losing geopolitical influence. It was an attempt to assert control in a situation where control was already slipping. Europe's compliance with the U.S. order reflected that same anxiety. Leaders feared that resisting Washington would reveal Europe's lack of strategic leverage. At the same time, they feared that complying would reveal their lack of independence. That internal conflict generated a paralysis that global markets could sense instantly. The emotional instability behind the scenes matters because financial systems depend on confidence, and confidence cannot coexist with visible fear. Russia's reactions were also shaped by emotional calculus. Instead of responding impulsively, Moscow chose to use the West's instability to strengthen its alliances, shift its economic dependencies, and frame the West as unreliable. This approach allowed Russia to portray itself as composed while making the West appear inconsistent and reactive. Nations watching from the sidelines, especially those with reserves in Western banks, sensed the emotional volatility and began reevaluating their own relationships with the Western financial system. What becomes clear is that the collapse of stability wasn't triggered by one decision. It was triggered by a pattern: governments masking fear with force, masking vulnerability with punitive measures, masking insecurity with public narratives of strength. Every action taken in this crisis has revealed something uncomfortable. Beneath the policies and sanctions, beneath the speeches and official statements, major powers are acting out of fear of irrelevance, fear of losing influence, and fear of acknowledging that the world is shifting faster than they are prepared to handle.